So what we plan to do, or what we're going to do, is to analyse changes in earnings distribution. So we need to make a distinction at the very beginning between income and earnings. So traditionally, income inequality would look at all of the income that comes into a household. For example, the SILC, the Survey of Income and Living Conditions survey, looked at income and breaks it down by household. We're looking at earnings, looking at individuals' earnings, so not household earnings. And we look at it for 2006-2010, so it overlaps the end of the boom period and the economic turndown then in 2008, and that we're still going through. And what we want to look at is the impact of this period of economic turmoil on individuals' employment earnings. So what has happened to earnings in that period? And we do this using as economists, we can describe things as exciting data sets, right? Nobody else probably would consider them exciting, but we kind of jump up and down when we see nice numbers. Well, not even nice numbers, any numbers we jump up and down. So this is a great new data set that's available through the Central Statistics Office, which comes from information collected by the revenue commissioners. And it's based on this P35L return that individuals make, or that are made for individuals through the revenue commissioners. And we analyse changes then in employment earnings across the 5 years. We have a data set of about 1.4 million people, which is less than the number of people in employment in Ireland, because we only include people who are in employment for every year within our survey. So if you're employed only in one of those years, you won't be considered for the entire period. Or if you're employed for four of those years, and you're not for the fifth, then you're excluded from the entire sample. So we're going to look at inequality, and not just inequality. We look at the projection or the trends of income for the period by age, gender. We'll also look at sector, although I'll explain a bit more about the distinction that we've had to make about sector. The numbers aren't exactly comparative for what we have for age and gender and what we have for sector, but still very insightful to look at the breakdown by sector and what the experience has been by sector. So what we hope is that this allows us to shed light on what's happened to different groups over this important period. And the important period, as I've said, has overlapped a period of boom, so towards the end of the Celtic Tiger period, and then the recession and then downturn that we're currently experiencing. So you can see here, this is the story of two periods. If we look at employment on the right axis, we can see that we're at full employment coming up to 2007, towards the end of 2007, and a dramatic then increase in the level of unemployment, up over 14%. And at the same time, we see increases in emigration as well. So we move from a period of net migration into periods of net outward migration. And at the same time, we see GDP declining. So, if we were to smooth this out, we'd be looking at a bit of a cliff where GDP, the economy contracts dramatically in the same period. So we're talking about a deep recession. We might expect during that recession that incomes will decrease as unemployment picks up and companies cut costs and lay workers off. So not just lay workers off, so we don't just have an unemployment problem, we may also have an underemployment problem, which is evident in the live register numbers. And this is the underemployment that we see with reduced working hours, so people moving to 2-day, 3-day working weeks. What we have seen, the data we've seen from elsewhere has shown that earnings per hours worked and earnings per week decreasing from the period of Q1 2008 to the last data we have at the end of 2010. A small decline in the hours worked, about a 3% decline in the hours worked over that period. A very negligible, well, to call it a fall, it's 0.3% of a fall in earnings per week. So it's gone from €704 to just under €702. But in this period, what might we expect to have happened to inequality within the economy? we have to answer the so what question. What's the issue that income inequality raises for an economy and for a society? And the Spirit Level, the book The Spirit Level by Wilkinson and Pickett, presents what is strong, we might say strong circumstantial evidence. There are questions raised about causation here within that work, but certainly there's strong elements of association of higher levels of income inequality more likely to result or to be associated with, because we can't say that they result in them, poor educational achievement. So worse outcomes for kids in schools, lower life expectancy, worse health outcomes, lower life expectancy, and also morbidity, higher levels of morbidity, higher levels of violence and crime, social fabric breaking down with higher levels of income inequality, lower social mobility. So, and this can have a very strong psychological impact on people who are struggling to better themselves, to move up along the levels of income or socioeconomic groups, and lower levels of social trust and lower levels of social cohesion. We could point from the results of the referendum last week to a strong message coming out about distrust of state, lack of trust of politicians, and so on, that comes out of the kind of results that we saw. So Wilson and Pickett find very strong cross-country associations between levels of income inequality and these social and economic outcomes, which should worry governments, right? Which should worry states, because these are the kind of things that can undermine a society and undermine, less importantly perhaps, undermine an economy. So what we want to look at is earnings income inequality. So why do we look at that as opposed to income inequality? There has been some studies that have looked at income inequality, but Wilson and Pickett also make the argument, to which I'd have some sympathy, that it's impossible for governments not to influence income differences, right? Just through the actions that they make, even without a welfare policy, even without a taxation policies, through their role as employer, they will affect income equality. Through their roles as education providers or education enablers, they will affect income inequality, because there will be income differences between those who have higher levels of education and those who have lower levels of education. And labour market policies, setting up labour protection laws, for example, might affect the level of income inequality. We'll see later on when we look at sectors that there might be an issue there. The extent to which a state wishes to address the problems raised by income inequality depends on the degree to which there is inequality already in earnings. So you could say there are two approaches that a state could take to income inequality. One might be to say, we'll fix, or we'll try and ensure that there's less earnings inequality. Right? So people will generally earn similar levels, so that then there is less need then for taxation and redistribution policies. Or they may say, well, we'll see what comes out of the market, the labour market, and then we'll design taxation and welfare policies, redistributive policies, in order to ensure that there is, or to address, to make sure there is less income inequality. Right? So we can put in family income supports, we can put in place child payments, we can put in place job seekers benefit and so on, and we can tax higher income earners and use that money to fund income for lower earners or people who lose work. What's our experience so far? Well, the most recent survey of income inequality, which again looked at households, found that the Gini coefficient, which is our measure of income inequality, the higher the Gini coefficient, the more unequal income is. And they found a dramatic rise from 2009 to 2010. Having fallen initially over the period from about 2006 on, it was a dramatic increase. And there has been some debate within the literature and within policy circles about what might have driven that. Hopefully we can shed some light. On that. We aren't the only country that's experiencing a rise in income inequality. The OECD has found that income inequality has increased across, generally from the 60s and 70s, across its member countries. There has been a general rise in income inequality, and this has become more pronounced during the period of the economic crisis. They also state, and partly our motivation, is that there's greater inequality in wages and salaries. So that the single most important factor driving that is differences in wages and salaries. And they estimate that wages and salaries account for about 75% of household income. So looking at differences in earnings inequality should shed a lot of light on the sources of income inequality at the higher level. So what we've looked at is, as I said, this new data set. We've just over 1.4 million individuals within the data set. So these are individuals who have a P35L form submitted for all of the years in the study. When we come to look at sectors, we'll see that we look at all of the returns for every year, because some people might be in more than one sector. And generally, if we move on to the findings, generally what we find, as I said, is a period with two sub-periods. Right, so we can see here total median pay. So this is median pay for the entire set. We see is rising from the period 2006. That's the black. That's a very odd angle I'm at. So you can see there in the black from just over 26,000 euros to just over 30,000 euros median pay. But we see that coming down then in the second period from 2008 to 2010. Perhaps as we might have expected in a period of economic downturn, we would expect wages and salaries to go down. What might be more interesting, when we look at it, we look at where is that falling in terms of gender, in terms of age, in terms of sector, and we'll try and get to some extent whether we can look at whether there's a public sector, private sector difference in the experiences as well. Although what we can look at there is fairly limited because we have to look through a sectoral lens as opposed to looking at the returns for those working in the private sector and those working in the public sector. We can see as well, if we break it down by male and female, a similar experience, so an initial rise and then a fall. But you can obviously see that median pay for males is higher than median pay for females. And this looks at the income differential, or the earnings differential for males and females over that period. What's striking about it, I think, is the decline in the differential, and the decline in the differential as a percentage of female median pay. So what this is saying is that the difference was 44% of female median pay in 2006. And the difference is 28% of female median pay in 2010. So what we're seeing is a decline in earnings, but a faster decline in earnings for males than we see for females, causing this narrowing of the differential. What we might think about the size of that differential is perhaps another question. But we are seeing it coming down. Also, if we take a look at our key point in terms of earnings inequality, and this looks at the Gini coefficient, and the Gini coefficient measures the extent to which there is an unequal distribution across the population. Right? So a perfect distribution would be where 10% of the individuals earn 10% of the earnings. 20% earn 20%. If 40% earn less than 20% of the income, then we're going to see an unequal distribution because more will be earned by those at the top end. What we see initially is a decline in income inequality, earnings inequality. That's going to be a problem for the entire presentation. So we see a decline in earnings inequality until we get to 2008 when it starts to pick up again. We see for females that it rises less slowly. For males, we see quite a sharp increase again. Well, it's from 35 to 38, but it's quite a sharp rise again. So it seems to be male inequality among male earnings that's driving this uptick, although there is a smaller uptick from 0.36 to 0.37 from 2009 to 2010 for females. This, I referred earlier on to the survey of income and living conditions, the SILC survey, which found an increase from 2009 to 2010. This is driving quite a bit of that. The increase from 2009 to 2010, the rate of increase in earnings inequality is faster than the rate of increase in overall income inequality. So that it's pushing up income inequality, not to the full extent, because it doesn't explain all of it, but it explains quite a bit of it. Maybe later on we can talk in terms of policy implications, but what we might expect to see, or what I might expect to find, is that as income inequality, earnings inequality rises, a counterbalancing redistributive policy could ameliorate that increase in earnings inequality. But what we expect is more cuts in the budget, which might, and if there are cuts in social protection, we might actually see that could exacerbate or intensify that increase in inequality. We speculate about that. We don't have evidence from this, but we might expect that might be one of the outcomes. So what do we see about earnings? If we break down earnings into a quintile, so the bottom quintile are the lowest 20%, and then the next quintile is the next 20%, and so on. We see the median pay from in 2006 and at the end of our period. And in the report, we actually break that down into, you can see the median pay in each year. And we do see an increase to 2008 and a decrease from 2010, but I've summarized it here. So what we can see is you can see obviously because of the breakdown in distribution, much higher salaries, much higher earnings down here at the bottom. But what's interesting is the rate of change. So we see quite an increase from 2006 to 2008 among lower paid workers, so those in the bottom quintile in terms of earnings, a 70% increase, and a much slower, so you can see it declines as income goes up. Now, of course, this is growing from a much lower base than these higher earnings are. It's reversed, I suppose. Right? We see a much smaller decline at higher levels than we see here. A lot of the pay gains for those in the bottom quintile from 2006 to 2008 are eroded from 2008 to 2010. So they're giving up much more than the top quintile in percentage terms. So the change over the period is masking this dramatic differences between the earlier and the later period. Overall, we see median pay going up by 17% at the beginning, then falling by 8%. So we get an overall 9%. So it's important to realize that people are, according to this measure, earning more. Those in employment are earning more in terms of median pay in 2010 than they were in 2006. So where the adjustment is coming, perhaps we could say that maybe they could be earning even more. So maybe the adjustment is coming in a smaller rate of increase, but certainly people those who are in employment aren't worse off in median terms than they were in 2006, just before the beginning of the downturn. Let's take a look at earnings mobility. So this is the movement between quintiles. So are people moving up, getting better off, or are they dropping down, getting worse off, or staying much the same? I suppose really it's a story of not much movement. I mean, just over half of people don't move quintile. They don't move up a quintile or down a quintile. You're equally as likely to move up as to move down. There's some difference, all right, between males and females. So males, as we saw earlier on, with male earnings declining, males slightly more likely, slightly higher percentage of them going into lower quintile than females, and a higher percentage than of females going into a higher quintile. It's interesting to look at age category. Now, we need to have a health warning attached to the 61 plus or over 65 years, which we talk about in the report. The data does not include occupational pensions, right? So it doesn't include any social welfare payments. but it doesn't include occupational pensions either. So occupational pensions have been taken out of the data set for us. We didn't take them out. We didn't get them in the data set. So, when we see low median income here, it understates the income of people over 65 who are in receipt of an occupational pension. We need to be very wary of interpreting then for that cohort. But what's interesting when we break it down by age is that we see that the largest portion in this, if you like, middle-age groups, 58% and 63% aren't moving quintiles. They're more or less, they're less income mobile, less earnings mobile. Now, still a high proportion of 16 to 30-year-olds don't move, but a majority do. And most move up. So it seems to be that this is beginning career, moving up into the quintile, and once we get into this area, your income mobility or your earnings mobility is slowing down. You're becoming less able to move on up to higher levels of quintiles. In fact, you're less than a 1 in 5 of 31 to 45-year-olds, and 12% then of 46 to 60-year-olds actually move up a quintile over this period. Now, this is a very short period. This is only 5 years in terms of income mobility. It would be interesting to look at a longer period where people might move. But once we break it down by age category, we're getting some way at that kind of dynamic of different ages or different age groups and how they move. So if you want to address income mobility, perhaps in this kind of age group, in terms of investment in education, in terms of getting people into higher paid work, or individuals trying to get themselves into higher paid work, this is where most of the income mobility will happen, rather than in the later age groups. We wanted to get at some distribution of income, and we want to look at what we call low paid workers. Now, there is no definition of low paid workers, although we are very conscious of phrases that have been used, for example, such as working poor, people who are in employment but yet earning a low income. And we wanted to get at that. Now, there is a measure for working poor of 60% of median income. So we took that percentage and are calling those who earn 60% or less of median earnings, we're calling those low paid individuals. So that's where this 60% is coming from. And we want to look at the number of low paid individuals. And we're finding that 26% in 2010, marginally down from 28%, of individuals are earning less than 60% of the median level of earnings, which was high 26,000. And we see that females are much more likely to be considered low paid individuals. Nearly 1 in 3 females in 2010 were considered to be in the low paid category. In the report as well, we gave a distribution, we gave a breakdown by earnings category and the number of employees in each category, and we can see that 60% or so are earning less than 40,000 euros per year. So the numbers, it is that the vast majority, or the large majority, are at the lower end of the spectrum than at the higher end of the spectrum. Something I should explain actually about my data set, which I forgot to say, is that the top 1% of earners are taken out of the sample. So we don't have the top 1% of earners. We have the other 99%, so it isn't a trim mean from both ends. It's just from the top end. And that's earnings, again, only from the P35, so only earnings from employment, not their other earnings, for which they wouldn't have a P35. We wanted to get at the extent to which the adjustment or the inequality or the fall in earnings is felt by some, not others, and what sectors and some sectors might feel it and some wouldn't. We would like to look at the effect on private sector workers and public sector workers We need to get more data. We need to have the data broken down in a different way in order to get at that. So hopefully that's another project we can do. So what we want, so an alternative way to get at this would be to look at it through sector. So to look at it through NACE sector. And these are the NACE sectors. Now we need to explain that and it's dealt with in more detail in the report. We include for every year, every individual. So even if they were not there for all of the 5 years, we include them for each year. Because we have to do this by sector rather than by individual. So because some individuals could work in more than one sector. If we aggregate by the individual, then we will lose sectoral difference and we couldn't rely on our results. So what we do is we categorize it by sector. So if somebody is earning 50,000 and 10,000 coming from one sector and 40 from another sector, we assign 10,000 to one sector and 40 to the other sector. So we have about 2.7 million observations for each year in this analysis, and that kind of explains why we see growth in these sectors in the second period in most of the sectors. When we would have expected if we were using the same data that a lot of these would be negative. What we see is percentage changes in median pay across sectors. That well, first of all, I suppose what's interesting is to look at those sectors which have high levels of median pay. Electricity and gas, for example, stands out quite highly. Information and communication technology. Professional scientific, and we have low levels then, administrative support, accommodation, food service, wholesale, retail, trade. Perhaps more seasonal work, more part-time work in these as well. We would have more in these sectors as well who are earning minimum wage or near minimum wage too. So what do we see? We see generally increases. I suppose what's interesting is that I suppose that higher sectors we're seeing lower increases, but we are seeing high increase, for example, here, all from a lower base, administrative support, accommodation, food service. But we see then a more significant adjustment here as well. Now, there's two adjustments, I suppose, that can be made in an economic downturn. You can reduce the wages of the people that are still in employment, or you reduce the level of employment. Now, this is only looking at one part of that. So we're only looking at those who have a P35 return for them. So if they're no longer in employment, we're not capturing it here. So this might explain why there is an increase in earnings. It could be that the adjustment is being felt more by those who lose their job rather than those who remain in employment. So we see small increases in median pay for those who keep their jobs, and those who rather than those at the expense perhaps of those who are losing their jobs. What we see as well is this. Well, actually, if I could just talk a small bit about this first of all, we looked at inequality for each of these sectors as well, and what we find is that there's a general trade-off or a negative relationship between the level of pay and the level of inequality. So a trade-off may exist. So in order to get more equality, it comes at higher levels of pay. So those who are earning more tend to be more equal. And this has implications then for policy, where if we wanted to address income inequality, well, one way, of course, might be to get back to growth, because we've seen that our period of growth has seen a reduction in earnings inequality. A second way, if this trade-off exists, would be higher wages. Now that has implications for the economy and competitiveness. So we need to do more around. I mean, this is quite a simple exercise, really, in data mining. We need to do a bit more around this. This is the gas, electricity sector. Even if we exclude this outlier, we can see a general downward trend. Also, those sectors which tend to be more, what we might call structured labour market, more structured, more unionised, more scales, levels of pay, like for example electricity and gas, which would have more public sector workers. Other as well would have quite a lot of public sector workers, which we explain in the report, because this would include education and health and so on in other. Those sectors tend to have higher levels lower levels of income inequality, higher levels of equality. Okay. So what have we seen? That the recession has led to increased earnings inequality, that while median pay is higher into 2010 than in 2006, it has declined from its peak in 2008. So we've seen we did see the increase up to the beginning of the recession, and then median pay decreased. We've seen a gender pay gap that has persisted but diminished over the period, and we have some evidence of employment income or employment earnings mobility. But most of the individuals, the majority of the individuals, stay in the same quintile. Then when they move, most of the movements are one quintile up or one quintile down. Very few move more than one quintile in either direction. I think it was about 12% that moved either in total that moved between 2006 and 2010 more than one quintile. There are a greater number of females that are classified as low paid workers. This could be driven by greater proportion of part-time workers, for example, so they would earn less. The sectoral analysis shows that median pay varies substantially across sector, and the less that sector is exposed to domestic demand conditions, so the more it is protected. For example, with having more public sector workers and not competing with the private sector, with the private market, then the higher is median pay, and the higher is median pay, the more equal, less income inequality that's there. So there appears to be this negative relationship that we want to explore some more between employment income inequality, earnings inequality, and median pay.